Welcome back. This week we'll be talking about how different environments, our social, physical, and built environments, can directly lead to the development of sicknesses or illnesses. We'll be talking about the different environments, social, physical, and built environments, and how these directly impact human health. We'll also talk about privilege and oppression in relation to these different environments. So, first, the social environment. This is going to include the social norms, attitudes, beliefs, practices, and ideas shared by the people in a particular region or culture. Let's think, what are some examples of things in our social environment which could be harmful to particular groups? We could maybe give some examples of things like discrimination or residential segregation, denial of basic human rights, lack of access to healthcare. We have just countless examples of things in the social environment that could be harmful to different groups, but particularly marginalized and oppressed groups most often. Why would these things contribute to negative health outcomes? We discussed a little bit last week that discrimination or experiences of hate crimes or different isms, different phobias, those experiences can lead to psychological distress, but also an increased allostatic load, increased inflammation, and all kinds of other negative health outcomes for both the psychology and the physical body of individuals and community members. We have a short crash course list here of different parts of the social environment that can be sickening or that could lead to illnesses, sicknesses, and disabilities. Just to reiterate, discrimination, isms, things like racism, sexism, classism, so on. Hierarchies, right? Stratifying individuals into different positions in society based off of their relative amounts of power and privilege. And of course, inequality and inequity in a variety of different forms. One key sickening part of our social environment would be racism. There are a couple different kinds of racism that we can discuss, but of course, we're all very familiar with racism as a overarching concept of discrimination against individuals based off of race in a way that is power related. So specifically discrimination against BIPOC individuals, Black and Indigenous people of color. We have cultural racism as one example here. This would be the type of racism that creates an ideological environment where BIPOC individuals are perceived as lesser than white individuals. This includes having negative beliefs or believing in stereotypes, as well as prejudice. These attitudes and beliefs are very widespread in our current society. And we also know that BIPOC individuals might experience internalized racism and stereotype threat as well. Internalized racism, meaning that when a person lives in a society or a region where they're hearing racist stereotypes or beliefs or ideologies on a regular basis, it's impossible not to absorb those ideas. You don't have to believe them, but just that knowledge that they exist can lead oneself to police oneself, right? To think, um, am I doing things that align with these stereotypes? Am I needing to behave in a different way? Are the things that are a part of my culture seen as negatively? Should I maybe not participate in those things? And all of these kinds of potentially very harmful beliefs, also directly related to stereotype threat, which would be that experience previously mentioned where a person may avoid engaging in certain behaviors or actions or practices to avoid being seen as confirmation of a stereotype. So a person might avoid doing something that they know society says, oh, this group does this, or this kind of group or person is like that. They may avoid engaging in those behaviors so as to not reinforce those stereotypes. We also see institutional and structural racism throughout our society. This is just another type of racism or another definition of racist beliefs and practices. This specific type would be where structures and policies, such as laws and legislation, restrict access to resources and opportunities for BIPOC individuals. Some historical and current examples of this practice would be residential segregation, redlining, the relocation of Indigenous peoples to reservations, isolating groups to areas for education and medical care, that kind of informal residential segregation, and countless other examples that would be examples of institutional or structural racism. We also have individual level discrimination, which would be discrimination usually one-on-one or from small groups to small groups or individuals. This would be discrimination in housing, renting, employment, medical care, education, getting a loan, and so on. A person might not be hired for a job because of their race, might be denied medical care or given lower quality medical care because of their race. Maybe they don't get into an educational institution because of their race, or they're denied a home loan and they can't move into an area or buy a house that they want to buy because of their race. All of that could be examples of potentially an intersection of institutional and individual level discrimination and racism. Um, but the lines are a little bit blurry sometimes between these categories. The overarching issue is that discrimination against individuals of different races, specifically non-white individuals or BIPOC individuals, being disenfranchised and denied power, stripped of power, or oppressed in these different contexts. There are a whole bunch of different health effects of discrimination and negative health outcomes related to experiences of racism, as well as other different kinds of discrimination as well. We might see a poor well-being overall, poor mental health, lower self-esteem, experiences of depression, anxiety, psychological distress, and low life satisfaction, personality changes and trauma, and as well as PTSD, cardiovascular or heart diseases, high BMI or a higher body weight, such as obesity, high blood pressure and increased inflammation, a weakened immune system, more high-risk health behaviors and fewer health-promoting behaviors. This could mean, more substance use or substance abuse, reckless driving, poor coping skills, and a decreased likelihood of seeking healthcare or following treatment plans. So people who are experiencing that high level of discrimination in their day-to-day life might be less likely to go to the doctor, especially if they've had negative experiences with medical professionals. And they may also be less likely to follow treatment plans. They may be less likely to stick to a medication schedule or to make lifestyle adjustments. And all of this is due to the intense psychological toll and physical toll that experiencing discrimination can have on a person. Switching gears now to discuss the physical environment and how the physical environment can be sickening. The physical environment is going to include the animals, plants, landscapes, weather, air, soil, and water of a particular region. This is all of those naturally occurring elements of the environment. So let's think about what are some examples of things in the physical environment that are harmful to human health. Some examples could potentially be dangerous pollutants in the environment, dangerous chemicals that are naturally present on Earth, such as arsenic or other kinds of poisons or venoms. There are also microbes or microorganisms, such as amoebas or bacteria, that are naturally present in the physical environment but can definitely cause health problems. Of course, we also have wild animals, things like bears, mountain lions. There are a lot of different health risks in the physical environment. It's also important that we look at how humans have influenced the physical environment to make it less healthy over time. We've done a lot of things like mining and fracking, drilling, um, deforestation. We've made a lot of impacts that have harmed the physical environment and then, in turn, lead our physical environment to be less healthy over time. The use of fossil fuels and the pollution of plastic in the ocean, all of these kinds of practices, which of course are not the fault of any individual alone, but decades and decades of human interference and progress in the environment. This has made the environment less healthy for us and less healthy itself over time.
So in discussing the physical environment as well as the other types of environment, it's important that we acknowledge the exposure disease paradigm. And this is a perspective that essentially tells us that exposure to those environmental health hazards of any kind can directly lead to the development of disease in humans. We do see in patterns across the data that impoverished individuals, as well as Black and Indigenous and people of color, are often at higher risk for exposure to these environmental health hazards, in particular environmental health hazards in the built environment and the social environment, but also in regions with higher levels of naturally occurring environmental health hazards in the physical environment. Some environmental health hazards that are often found in impoverished areas can include things like non-potable water, which is water that's not safe to drink, radon gas, which is a gas that can be found often in the basements of homes, also flood-prone regions. We see this all over New York, areas that are often lower income or lower SES, areas that are built over swamp regions or streams or creeks. And then with the rising of sea levels, we do see an increase in floods. This is also the case across the global south. There are a lot of developing nations which are very flood prone, especially island regions where those populations tend to be lower income, or countries or nations that have lower GDPs just across the board. We also might see chemical pollution at higher rates in these regions. That could be pollution of the air, soil, water, and so on. A lot of this is due to factories in the area, manufacturing, and other things that are creating these environmental health hazards, particularly with chemicals, things like asbestos, things like lead paint, lead pipes. We do see this across the United States, but we are only seeing this at this point after lots of improvements and renovations in certain areas that mostly these hazards are still present in lower socioeconomic status regions. Moving on now to discussing the built environment, this is going to include all of the things that people have built for our use in daily life. So this could be buildings, technology, recreational spaces, and so on. Of course, the social environment can also be considered a form of the built environment, but here we're looking a little bit more at the physical, tangible aspects of the environment rather than those kind of cultural or ideological parts of the social environment. One of the most important things that we acknowledge with built environment is that it can be very inaccessible to those with disabilities. The way that we build our buildings, the type of technology that is available to us, and recreational spaces or areas such as even restaurants that people can go to for leisure activities, recreational activities, or even for things like doctor's visits, these spaces can be inaccessible to a lot of individuals. And the tricky thing about that is that the built environment is, well, built. And so when we build places, especially buildings that are not accessible, that was a choice, right? So we can always make the choice to build accessible environments, accessible buildings, and to make accessible technology such as, adding closed captions or to a video, or offering, a braille menu in a restaurant, things like that. The built environment is something that we create, so we can create it in really any way that we choose to. Let's also think about, what are some ways that the built environment could contribute to negative health outcomes? And not even just for disabled people, but for anybody in general. How could the environment that humans create be negative or harmful to our health? There are a lot of health hazards in the built environment. These would be things that humans either created or manufactured to be used in the built environment, and a lot of these we didn't actually know were harmful until pretty recently in our history. Some of these have always been harmful, but a lot of this has been researched over the last handful of decades, and now we know a lot better what health effects these kinds of health hazards can have. So this would be examples like old electrical infrastructure, old, power grids that are in disrepair. In this case, that could be a health hazard because of potential electrical fires, as well as extreme temperatures and the power grid going out in instances of high heat and then people not having AC, or very cold temperatures and people not being able to access heating. Internet is also very important for a lot of daily life, and so if the internet goes out because the power goes out, that can have some pretty significant consequences on the function of medical institutions like hospitals and other situations like that. We also see things like noise pollution or a lack of sunlight and high exposure to artificial lighting, particularly spending more time in artificial lighting than in actual sunlight can have some negative health effects, particularly on vitamin levels and things like depression and anxiety. We also know that regions that don't have public parks or a lot of community recreation areas the people in those communities tend to be less healthy. It's very important that we have those recreational areas or those parks for outdoor recreation, for community building, and for social solidarity. And we also see examples of things like lead paint and plumbing. These were used for many, many decades, and only in the last about 40 years have lead paint and plumbing become not regularly used, but we do still see a lot of low SES areas that have not had updated buildings or renovations that still have lead paint and plumbing, as well as asbestos, very similar cases with those two examples there. So all of these, this is not an exhaustive list, but all of these are examples of potential health hazards that are present in our built environment and that are created by or built by or made by humans for our use. As we've seen through the last few weeks of our class, there are a lot of differences in the patterns of negative health effects or detrimental health outcomes depending on the region that we're looking at and the population that we're looking at. When it comes to the built environment, we see residential segregation as one example of how these patterns tend to play out, specifically in a class-related way, but also in a race and ethnicity-related way as well. So residential segregation is the division of people by groups into residential areas in a disproportionately inequitable and stratified way. So most often this is done by racial and ethnic lines in the United States. It is no longer mandated by law, though there were laws throughout a lot of US history mandating that people of different races, specifically BIPOC individuals, live in these lower income regions, which often have fewer resources, they're more disenfranchised, and they might have more of those negative health effects from those environmental hazards. So throughout history and today, we do see that low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods with higher populations of Black and Indigenous and people of color, we tend to see this overlap occurring in a way that is definitely no coincidence. These low-income regions tend to have more environmental health hazards, so those things like pollution, asbestos, lead paint, and plumbing, fewer community resources like parks and gyms and those community recreational areas. We also see less accessible and often lower quality education institutions and medical care, and food deserts. Food deserts would be places where there are few food options that are, fresh produce, fresh meat, fresh dairy, a lot more processed food, which calling food healthy or unhealthy is a little bit too simplified when we're talking about nutrition, but places that have limited access to, sorry, my cats are getting in a tiff over there, limited access to nutritionally dense foods. We also might see fewer pharmacies, fewer job opportunities, and higher crime rates in a lot of these low SES regions. And it's important to acknowledge that that is not the fault of the residents. There are a lot of confounding factors that lead to all of these, disenfranchised communities having these patterns of poor health, of all of these different hazards, all of these different lack of resources. There are a lot of factors at play there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more throughout the semester as we dive more into how both race and class are related to health. To give a quick summary of what we discussed this week, we can see that both the social, physical, and built environments, they all contain health hazards. There is some overlap between all of these. We don't have to necessarily divide them specifically into separate categories. It's important that we just look at how environments of different kinds can have negative effects on human health or can directly lead to detrimental health outcomes. Also important that we see that marginalized communities, so Black and Indigenous people of color, low-income communities, people with disabilities, all of these disenfranchised groups and oppressed communities, these are the groups that are at the highest risk of experiencing those negative effects or those detrimental health outcomes because of high rates of exposure to those environmental hazards. So if we're looking at the social environment, it might be those experiences of discrimination. The physical environment, it might be pollution, in a particular region, more flood-prone regions. And then with the built environment, it could be inaccessible environments for those with disabilities or environments that have man-made chemicals such as asbestos or lead pipes, lead paint, things like that. There are a lot of things that we can do to reduce the impact of our environment. Um, there are a lot of efforts that we can take as individuals, particularly with our social environment, to create an inclusive environment for those around us and not be contributing to the stress and discrimination that other groups may be experiencing or that our own group may be experiencing. We can also work to avoid aspects of the physical environment that are harmful. We'll talk a little bit about antibiotic resistance in a following week. We'll talk about how the built and physical environment kind of interplay there when it comes to microorganisms and human interaction with them. And it's also important that when we are creating or contributing to the built environment, that we are trying to make an accessible, inclusive environment for everyone. That could include things like adding alt text to your Instagram posts, adding captions to your YouTube videos, or if you are part of any kind of architectural project, making sure that there are elevators and ramps instead of only stairs for wheelchair users. There's a lot that we can do to mitigate these effects, but of course, a lot of these negative health effects and negative environmental conditions are contributed to or even caused by large corporations, governments, and individuals are not always or often going to be the catalysts for these large-scale environmental detriments. So personal responsibility is not necessarily something you need to be taking on when it comes to the environment, doing just your part to make things a little bit better, and then also pushing for those large-scale changes from those large, massive institutions can also make a very big difference.